Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're most pleased to bring you a two-week series of a discussion about disability issues, laws, and policies in our country. And as our viewers, I'm sure know, the Americans with Disability Act, passed in 1990, is at the heart of this discussion that we'll be having. We're very fortunate to have two guests today to discuss this important issue, and we'll be back with you again next week. First of all, I welcome to the program Vicki Looney, who is with the Idaho Americans with Disability Act Task Force. Thank you for being with us, not only on this program, but at the college with the presentations that you're doing.
Thank you.
And I'm so pleased to have Sharon Daniels, who's a colleague, Sharon Daniels Bullock, who is the coordinator of the North Idaho College Center for Educational Access. And Sharon, it's been a pleasure working with you over the years and your commitment to this cause.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm pleased to have our regular panelist, Erna Reinhardt, who's Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, and she will commence today's questioning.
Hi Sharon, hi Vicki, and welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
We hear a lot about the ADA and the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we probably don't have a real good understanding of what that all encompasses. So this is good. We'll have a nice discussion about what exactly it is and what does it mean and how is it enforced and those kinds of things. But I want to start first with Vicki. Explain to us when it went into effect and what it is.
Well, the Americans with Disabilities Act came into effect, signed by George Bush Sr. in 1990. And really its significance is that it was sort of the last frontier of the civil rights movement. There had been other acts touching around the issues of disability, acts dealing with children in schools, children with disabilities in schools, and acts dealing with seniors with disabilities, and acts dealing with veterans with disabilities. But the ADA was definitely the most comprehensive act that dealt with not only physical accommodations, which we think most of, but also with accommodations in programming, accommodations and issues of discrimination and retaliation in employment. As far as state and local government went, there are actually 5 titles to the ADA. The first one, and I have a little cheat sheet here, it's called The Guide to Disability Rights, put out by the Department of Justice. It's a fine little pamphlet. You can go online and get that from them, www.dog.gov. And the first title is employment, which a lot of us are the most familiar with, talking about reasonable accommodation in the workplace, which is an issue that we're all very concerned with. Title II involves state and local government entities and entities that take money from the state and local government. And Title III is what a lot of us are becoming more and more interested in, and that is accessibility, both program accessibility and accessibility in public accommodations. And then Title IV, dealing with telecommunication relay systems, which really no one has ever heard of. And we don't get a lot of questions on those. The relay systems are getting better. I mean, the issues are still out there. They are getting better. And then the last title, Title V, is just kind of a catch-all title. We hear very little about it, and at the task force we deal very little with it. And then there have been some new turns. There is a Section 508 now that deals with accessibility of computers and other kinds of relay systems. You deal with those most especially when you're talking about people, quadriplegia, paraquadriplegia, hearing deficits, sight deficits, and getting accessibility to that type of thing. So in a nutshell, usually it takes about an hour and a half to talk about the ADA, but I just gave you about a 3-minute overview.
I just have a follow-up question for Sharon. That's a very good explanation and a very broad definition, so that's good for us to understand. But Sharon, who all falls under those guidelines? I mean, is it small businesses? Is it schools? Who all needs to be aware of what those regulations are, and who needs to follow that?
It'd be easier to say who doesn't. need to be aware of these laws and rules. It pertains to all public entities, organizations, agencies. Probably Vicki might be able to answer the question better than I. I work with Title II pertaining to agencies receiving federal funding, so in particular to very specific to what I do. So, but generally speaking, the Americans with Disabilities Act covers a broad range of both public and private entities and responsibility to accommodate individuals with disabilities.
Okay.
Vicki, would you like to expand on that?
Well, it's in a sense it follows the money, in a sense. That's one aspect of it. Also, the service you offer, if it's quote a public accommodation, you fall under that. For example, I knew a woman who ran a private daycare, and she had quite a few children, but it was a big area. I mean, she was within the licensure, but she decided to have her services checked for fire and go through that, and they came in and said, "I'm sorry, we're going to have to shut you down." She said, "But it's a private home. I'm running a home business." And they said, "I'm sorry, but this is a public. You're bringing the public into your home." And so she said, "Well, let me see how much it would take." And she had an estimator come out, and it was going to take her $35,000 to bring her little home daycare in compliance with the ADA. And so, I mean, it touches that. So on one sense, you can follow the money, but on the other sense, to say, well, since it's something in my home, it's naive to think that the ADA can't, reach out and touch you. And so that's a difficult question to answer, but it also follows a little bit the number of employees you have. In the state of Idaho, it's 5. Nationally, it's 15. But in the state of Idaho, if you have 5 or more employers, then you're under the ADA also.
Okay.
So that's because of state policy and state regulation.
That's a state issue.
In other words, any state must meet the federal criteria, but you can have even more extensive coverage if you choose to do so, but not less.
Yeah, and we're very excited right now. Idaho is entering into a period of, should be in legislation next year, of getting an IDA, an Idaho Disabilities Act, and the task force and the SILC are working together, State Living Independent Council are working together to pass an Idaho Disabilities Act. I don't know how much of this you want me to go into, but there are trends right now with the Supreme Court and federal district courts to chip away at the ADA. Many of the, I'll keep my party affiliation out of it, many of the court systems and the folks who are in political power now are trying to chip away a little bit, and they're trying to take some things away from it. Like, for example, to be considered disabled, you have to have some life activities impaired. Well, originally working was a life activity. That has now been taken out. If your disability impairs only your job, originally that would qualify you. That's one of the prongs that would be qualified. That has been taken away. Working is no longer considered an essential life activity. So that's tightening down a little bit. You have to have something else now.
There's clarification on that. So if someone is working at a job in a facility and they have a very identified disability, not being in a wheelchair, for example, are you saying that this new interpretation means that business doesn't have the same obligations they used to have toward that employee?
What that means is to fall under the definition, to fall under the ADA definition of disability. Now, it's a 3-prong test, so there are other things that you have to meet. But for the one prong about whether or not you meet the limiting life activity disability, Working's not that. But see, that person that you're talking about would have the mobility disability, or they would meet the mobility issue. They would meet perhaps the self-care issue. I mean, there are other things.
So the business would still be oftentimes required to deal with it under one of the other criteria.
The reason I bring this up is there's a case, Sutton versus United Airlines, and it happened to be twins, and they had myopia. Without their glasses, they couldn't see, and with their glasses, they could see fine. And they went to United, and they were looking for a promotion, I believe it was. And United said, well, we're not going to give you a promotion. With your eyeglasses, you see 20/20. Or we're not going to give you, an accommodation. You can see 20/20. And the court came out and said, yeah, that's right. With an accommodation, you can see 20/20. You don't meet the other requirements of a disability, therefore, you're not disabled.
Okay. Sharon, I'd like to pursue in a particular area. First of all, let me give a little background, is that from 1964 all the way up into the 1990s, we've had a series of laws passed. The very famous law in 64, a civil rights law dealing with particularly accommodations in race and color and religion and national origin. And we had one dealt with Rehabilitation Act, but then this major act came in 1990, and as Vicki has said, they're almost bookends from the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 90 Act and dealing with civil rights issues, although there's some others since then. Based upon that, you're in the field of education. Would you share with our viewers some of the components under the 90 law that in institutions, K through 12 and higher education, have had to meet since the passage of this law? And I'll add one other note. It's my understanding when the law passed in 90, the government was recognizing that there's some time for adjustment, so there was a 5-year implementation period for some of the aspects of it. But with that background, what are some of the things that education institutions are doing today they did not do in the past?
Well, I think primarily and specifically the biggest change has been in the provision of accommodations for programs and services for agencies, organizations receiving federal funding. And the 1973 Rehab Act defines very well the kinds of things that are appropriate to do for an individual to accommodate them, to allow them to have equal access to education. For a person in a wheelchair who can't get in the classroom because there's no elevator, obviously that's a barrier to their being able to become educated. And something that simple seems obvious, but there are issues out there going on in colleges and schools where they cannot get that access. Well, what happened in 1973 was that law was passed, and it was a very good law, but a lot of people just didn't pay attention to it. It didn't happen. It didn't get played out. And so the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, which became to have a civil rights focus, put power behind the 1973 Rehab Act. And so I know that in the field of education, especially in post-secondary, things started changing at that time. I think some of the colleges saw it coming and started implementing accommodations prior to that. So accommodations services can mean blind students receiving Braille in the classroom, can mean magnification of curriculum, written material so that visually impaired students can read it. It can mean putting textbooks on tape, audio tape, using audio tape for testing for students that have learning disabilities and cannot neurologically interpret symbols as other people do. It can, like I said, it can have to do with actual physical access to rooms and
or special
areas.
testing periods, quiet periods, and
yes.
But is it, one more question back to Erna, and that is, and you've done such a good job interpreting the law and being really balanced and fair. Also, the student in a private way can be tested and know that they have a disability, and that it's that certification that puts this all in place.
Documentation of the disability
Right.
is what you're talking about. Yeah, in the school systems, the K through 12 systems, the school districts are actually responsible to do that, and of course they also fall under the IDEA law in terms of accommodation of students. The post-secondary level students are, again, required to provide documentation, but basically that is something that's necessary for everyone. The student needs to understand what is the issue. How should they take care of themselves? What is it that they need? If they don't have that information, they can't advocate for themselves. And really, they're the individual that needs to know how to do that.
For those that want to cooperate, faculty, and all, they need to know how they can assist too, and that
Correct.
require documentation.
Correct. They need to know, we need to know, how can we best assist the student to be successful. And there's no point in offering accommodations that are not effective, the student really doesn't need, nobody really understands. So that part of it, and in getting the medical and the health professionals involved, is really necessary to defining, okay, so what exactly is going on with this person, and what barriers based on the law, as Vicki was talking about, are present, and is there a barrier to learning and education? That's the question. Can this student learn the same way the majority of students learn, or do they need something to be different?
They still meet the same criteria, it's just that these are removing barriers towards meeting those same requirements.
Correct. They still meet the same criteria at the post-secondary level. It's a little bit different in terms of, and probably that would be a huge discussion at the K through 12. But at the post-secondary level, law supports that colleges do not have to lower their standards academically in order to accommodate students. And actually, my experience in working with disabled individuals is that is the way they want it.
Sure.
They want to feel like they made it,
Sure.
honestly,
Yeah.
and have achieved what other students have achieved.
Erna Reinhardt.
I want to go back to Vicki to talk a little bit about what is the Idaho ADA Task Force and what kinds of things do you do?
Okay, the Idaho Task Force is one of, I believe every state has a task force. There are, I think, 10 regions in the United States and 10 funding areas within the United States, and they funnel money down to task force throughout the United States. We are funded by what they call DIBTAC, which is out of Portland. We are on a very small budget, actually. We sound like a huge organization, you know, a task force. And we actually have 1 3/4 persons, and they sent the 3/4 to see you today. So we are not advocates, which is an odd role for me, because since I've been in the disability community, I have always been the role of an advocate. But we are not an adversary organization. We provide information referral. We do trainings like the one I will be doing up here in northern Idaho over the next couple of days. We do consultations with people. We do like site reviews, for example. If an architect calls and says, I have these plans, I want to know if they're up to code or meeting ADA standards, then they can send them over, and we have little wheelchair models that we can run through the plans and see whether or not the corners meet and all that. The executive director will go out. She is in a wheelchair, and she can go out and actually get on the premises and determine whether or not everything is accessible. We also have you don't even know these things exist, but we have a weight thing. A door can't be more than 5 pounds to be accessible. So we have this little thing that we can push on a door, so many inches from the 6 inches out from the side of the door. It has to be no more than 5 pounds of push. So that's the kind of thing we do. But it's important to know that we are not an adversary organization, and we go tell people what their rights are as an employee, and we tell employers what their rights and duties are too. So, a lot of people call us and say, go down to so-and-so place and tell them that they can't do that. And we have to say, we can't do that. Call another organization. And
Great. Vicki, if somebody wanted to get a hold of you or contact your agency, how would they do that?
Unfortunately, we don't have an 800 number, so I can't help there, but we do have, we are in Boise. Our number is area code 208-334-5590. Our email address is, this is all one word, adataskforce@qwest.net. And then the website that we gave out, we're just getting up our own website. So the website that I'm going to give you is the one from our region, and that's www.nwada.org. But the quickest way is just 208-344-5590, and you will either get Bobby Ball, that's Ms. Bobby Ball, she's executive director, or you'll get 2/3, and that would be me.
That's Vicki Looney.
That's Vicki Looney. Yep.
Great.
Well, we
Thank
have
you.
a wonderful, wonderful staff, and while you were talking, they put up those numbers on the screen, and we have both audio and visual, both of that. Our staff is very conscientious, and they do that with all of our shows, and we appreciate it. Sharon, I'll come back to you and talk a little more about what Vicki's talked about, that the law covers 5 areas, and we spent a lot of time today on employers on the show so far, and on education. I've had some experience in another arena, and Vicki and Sharon both can answer this, but I will start with Sharon. It's kind of a 2-part question. One is that since we've talked about businesses, and by the way, many businesses have been very cooperative, and they want their employees to be happy and have good morale, and certainly education institutions, most of them have cooperated. But governments themselves, local cities and counties and state government is also very involved with this law. Would you start with saying, are their requirements very much the same, or any experience you've had with them? As students graduate from certain programs too, a number of them going to work in government as well as the private sector. Just a general question about how you see the cooperation of government in this process.
Well, I think every locale is different in terms of the cooperation of government. And in terms of services that are offered, they are very much the same. We're always talking about access to space. We're always talking about access to facilities. We're always talking about receiving information in an accessible form. I've heard talk about, do you need a Braille menu? Well, no, you don't really need to have Braille menus. You still need to provide information in accessible form to individuals. I think the Americans with Disabilities Act is a fairly new law, and it has developed over that period of time, I think, in different levels, depending upon where you're at in the nation. It is a federal law. I would say by and large, I just see it as being a growing thing, and my expectation is that it will continue to grow as it does get more and more involved in government. Right now there's the Supreme Court issue in Tennessee that does involve the state government of Tennessee and the federal government's their sovereignty, the state sovereignty, basically on a broad scale. But there are other areas in the nation that, in California, I know that over on the West Coast that things are a lot in terms of its involvement with the ADA and how much agencies, colleges, and agencies and the culture is willing to do to accommodate people is much different than, let's say, that it is particularly in Idaho. It just depends on the area. But overall, it's coming, it's here, it's happening.
Vicki, what's your experience been in relation to this issue? Oh, and I know you're not out there as an advocate to go to court now, but you do have a lot of contacts.
Well, I think one thing that I want to say before this show is over is that there's a lot of misconception about the ADA. One thing, you are not grandfathered out of the ADA. Sorry, folks. Just because your building was there before the act was there, if you are a public accommodation, you need to comply. The other thing is, you have to do what they call readily achievable readily achievable barrier removal. It's a very hard thing to say. And in reality, what that means is you don't have to put an elevator, there's something called an elevator exception, but you don't have to do something that's going to put you out of business. And so for people out there who own businesses to the little mom and pop store that doesn't have room to expand their bathroom, we're not going to put you under. If you can't do it, you can't do it. And I think there's a lot of hidden anger because businesses think that the task force and people with disabilities are out to get them if they can't comply. And I think that causes a lot of hidden anger. I think misunderstandings and misconceptions are still just out there.
Government entities or large corporations have more resources, and so based on what you're saying, they would be expected to do more than a very small business that could not financially afford to do so.
That's correct.
And so
That's
the
correct.
law or its interpretation.
It's based on your whole worth. It's based on your whole worth. And if you can do one thing now and then something else next month and then something else next month, you don't have to do the whole thing at once. You bite off little pieces if you can. So
I take what you're saying to mean, and again, concerned about the very small business, that if they are in that state now being concerned, should they relax and say that as they contact or work with ADA organizations, that they should feel free to express what their concerns are and show what they can and can't do, that there's negotiations or work in that process?
Yeah, we're a perfect example. My daughter and I own a business, have just opened a business, and I had the executive director of the task force come over, do a site review, and she said, we had a turning radius problem of 6 inches, and so she came over and said, do this and do this and do this. She gave me 3 things to do, and we're going to bite them off, as we can. And I feel confident that we're in compliance with the law. We don't have to go out there and rip the bathroom all out at once and do all of these things. We're going to start with something as basic as putting the right kind of handle on the door, and then we'll do the next thing, and then we'll do the next thing. So you don't have to go in and rip your place apart.
Another thing that I've noticed too, and it may have something to do with the weight of the door, it's a kind of a detail, but there's buttons put on the outside where you push that and the door automatically opens, and that way then the weight could be different, I would assume. For the door.
Yeah, if you have an automatic door. Yeah.
So there's alternatives in
Sure.
the process without taking the door itself down. On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. Vicki Looney and Sharon Daniels Bullock, thank you very much. It's been very informative, and I, as always, believe and hope our viewers have gotten very valuable information that they can use, and we appreciate your time. And Vicki, I know you have to go to give a speech, and a little late in doing that, but you were so kind to take this much time out for us and to be able to share you with our viewers throughout the Northwest and in Canada. And good luck in your work. And thank you again very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will be with us again next week when we will close out this 2-week series by continuing to talk about disability issues in this country. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.